We're going to be in Daniel chapter 5 today. There's about a 70-year or so gap between chapters 4 and chapters 5, all right? So kind of figure that in your mind. Nebuchadnezzar II has died. He had two sons that kind of fought for power and reigned about 7 years. And then someone who was not of the royal line, Nabonidus, took over the throne. Now, to legitimatize his reign, he married a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And so it's interesting to know that Nabonidus' mother was the high priestess of the moon god Zen in Tema, where Nabonidus is going to go. Now notice it says Belshazzar, not Belteshazzar, but Belshazzar, and it means, may Baal protect the king. May Baal protect the king. Now, we've had a lot of problems with this because we haven't found this guy listed. Notice it says the king. We have cuneiform documents that list all the Babylonian kings. Nabonidus is there, but not Belshazzar. Years ago, those who think the Bible is a made-up story begin to say, well, obviously this story's made up. It's kind of fanciful, this writing on the wall anyway. But you know, every time archaeology has done its work in the ancient Near East, the historicity of the Bible has been corroborated. We know now from documents, not from speculation, but from documents, that around 54, Nabonidus made his son co-regent because about 522, Nabonidus had gone off to the holy city of the moon god Zen. Remember, his mother was high priest. And he had kind of left affairs of Babylon to his son, Belshazzar. This is one of the unique relationships of a son being co-regent. And yet now it's documented. Well, you say he wasn't king, he was co-regent. Well, the word king here is kind of like we sometimes say President so-and-so. Before they were really president. We call them president. Well, that's kind of this thing here. It's not a real problem in the text. Held a banquet. Now, the Septuagint says, at the dedication of his palace. But that doesn't seem to fit well. It's going to be 1,000 people invited. Obviously, it's a religious holiday or a state holiday. Now, some have said, since they knew the Babylonian army, the Medo-Persian army was close, and the city was under siege at this time, maybe it was just kind of a way to forget the problems that were right outside the gate. We just don't know. Held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of 1,000. And boy, we have ancient documents of how wild some of these Oriental drinking parties got. Okay? When Belshazzar tasted the wine, now most of us feel like that there's one of two interpretations here. Either he offers the first toast and no one could drink till the king drank, or it's a phrase that meant he would already become intoxicated or inebriated. He gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, and there are several things there. First of all, the gold and silver vessels. Now, these are the implements that were used in the temple that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586. They're mentioned several different places in the Bible. It was spoons and cups and bowls. But since there's 1,000 nobles and all this guy's concubines, I don't think there were that many bowls in the temple of Yahweh. Some have said he brought all the gold and silver bowls from all the different gods out. But it's particularly interesting that he is picking on Yahweh here for two reasons. Number one, it mentions his father, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, first of all, his father was not Nebuchadnezzar. It was his grandfather. Now, the Hebrew word father and son can have a wide meaning. There is no term in Hebrew for grandfather or grandson. It's this one word that means all the relationships. Now, he really was not related to Nebuchadnezzar except through Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, okay? They were not directly related, all right? His father, which really means ancestor, look at verse 11, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem. See 2 Kings 24:13, 2 Kings 25:15. And art the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Why is Nebuchadnezzar picking on Yahweh? Why at this part in time is he doing something that was obviously offend a deity? For we know from history these kings were very superstitious, and they wouldn't do anything to offend another deity. Well, in verse 22, Daniel's going to tell him, you knew all this that God did to Nebuchadnezzar. and yet you didn't respect it. It's kind of like he's making fun of Yahweh, saying, you did this to my granddaddy, but I'm going to make fun of you now. It's almost like he did it intentionally. That seems to be the implication. Now, notice it says his wives and his concubines drank with him. It's just a little note of historicity, but the Assyrian Empire and the Persian Empire, the empires of the Fertile Crescent on each side of Babylon, would not let their wives at these drinking feasts. But we know that Babylon did, and so it's just a little more corroboration of the historicity of the Bible. And they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. Okay? They drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, isn't it funny that this is the same kind of metals that are mentioned in chapter 2 for the different kingdoms? Now, we know that idols, if you see verse 23, were made of two kinds. Those which were carved, wood, and those which were cast, metal. So this is a general phrase for all the idols of Babylon. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Now, several things here. First of all, the lampstand. This is not the menorah from the temple. This is just the lampstand in the large chamber of the king's palace that lit the place up. Another archaeological corroboration is we found this king's palace, and lo and behold, two of the side walls of this large chamber are white plaster. Now, notice it says the back of the hand. Now, there's a real fuss in Hebrew. Does it mean this part of the hand or this part of the hand? Well, the Hebrew term is ambiguous, but it's obvious that a large humanoid figure that could not be seen past the wrist began to write on the plaster with his finger, or even maybe with a brush. We're not sure. But he saw the front part of the hand, or the hand, but couldn't see the rest. Now, there's been some speculation that only the king saw it. And others say, no, everybody saw it. But look at verse 6. You talk about a good description of a king who's lost his cool. This is it. Listen to this. The king grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking. This guy went berserk, I want to tell you. This guy his face lost its blood, his mouth fell open, his knees began to tremble, his hips trembled. He wasn't expecting this at all. The king called aloud. I bet he did. Bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. And the king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me will be clothed with purple, have a necklace of gold around his neck, and have authority over a third ruler of the kingdom. Now again, these kings are still thinking money can buy anything, and he sure wants these wise men to tell him. There's been some speculation of why he couldn't read this. Because Aramaic and Hebrew are close together, and this seems to be written in Aramaic. Why couldn't he read Aramaic? Well, the rabbis say that instead of it being written in its normal order, it was written vertical. Or it may be he could read the words, but he didn't understand their meaning for whatever reason. Now, when it says purple here, King James has scarlet. You must remember that ancient colors, be it for jewels or just colors, are very fluid from culture to culture and period to period. There is no term that really locks down these colors. We know that the purple is more of a royal symbol, and we think this guy's colors were blue and white. So maybe it's blue and white, but it's a symbol of royalty, whatever. A necklace of gold. This became a symbol of the king, but during the Persian period. So maybe the Persian usage of a gold chain and a symbol, it goes back to Babylon. We're not sure. And have authority over the third ruler in the kingdom. Well, that seems to fit, especially since Nabonidus was still king and Belshazzar was only co-regent. The highest office he could give is third. And that seems to fit the history as we know it. And all the king's wise men came in, and they could not read the inscription. Now, whether they could not read it or didn't want to read it, I don't know. But apparently they were befuddled. And here's another example. Chapter 2, Chapter 4, Chapter 5. The gods of Babylon are impotent. They can't know the secrets and histories of men. But the God of Israel does, and He reveals it to these obnoxious, prideful world leaders. That's the theme throughout these first 6 chapters. Now, The king Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. The queen entered the banquet hall. Now, the fact that she entered unannounced has caused real concern. The fact that she wasn't there when his wives were there. Now, she apparently is the queen mother. Now, there's been some speculation. Is she the mother of Nabonidus, or is she the wife of Nebuchadnezzar? Now, since there's only a 7-year period between the death of Nebuchadnezzar and the beginning of Nabonidus' reign, it's possible that Nabonidus not only married the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, but maybe the wife, the chief queen of Nebuchadnezzar. We're just not certain. But this lady seems to be somewhat aloof from the drunken brawl that's happening where the rest of his wives are. So it probably the queen mother, possibly related to Nebuchadnezzar. We're not sure. And she says, "O king, live forever," title of honor. "Do not let your thoughts alarm you, or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom a spirit of the holy gods." Now, we talked about that earlier. I don't think it's a phrase of monotheism, though it does appear that way in Joshua 24:19. But it seems to be these polytheist understanding that Daniel had a gift of interpreting dreams. Notice it mentions about how he was so important in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, your father. Had an extraordinary spirit, a gift for interpreting dreams. And so they called for him. His name was Belteshazzar. Okay, not Belshazzar, but Belteshazzar. Now Daniel now summoned, and apparently he was in retirement. Now whether he was just old, and of course he was. He's very old. In chapter 6, he's going to be about 80 or 90. So how old he is in 5, we're just not sure, but he's an older man. Maybe when Nabonidus took over, they totally changed all of the officers, and maybe Daniel was just not in court or something. And Daniel was brought before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you Daniel?" Notice he calls him by his Jewish name. I think this king had messed enough with Yahweh and didn't want to insult him anymore, so he didn't call him by his Babylonian name. He calls him Daniel. God is my judge. Who is one of the exiles from Judah. He knew this guy was from the very place of the God whom he had just insulted. Right? Whom my father the king brought from Judah, exiled. See, maybe he's kind of bragging, but we took you into exile. Well, now I heard about you, and the spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom is found. He just repeats what his mother said. Just now, the wise men and conjurers were brought before me. They might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you. He's trying to flatter him. He's going to give him all this stuff. Daniel knew what was happening. He didn't want to be third ruler for 6 hours. He says, "No, thank you, but you keep your gifts, king, but I'm going to tell you what it means." And so he begins here. First of all, he says there is a God who can give you this interpretation. And he is the God of heaven. Meaning he is the God of the gods of the Babylonians. But he is also the God of the Judeans, whom you looked down on and despised. Okay? And so, notice in verse 22, he tells about how God worked with Nebuchadnezzar. And then he says, "Let you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew this." That's why I think verse 22 is a key verse, that this king was doing this to spite Yahweh. For he knew what Nebuchadnezzar had gone through, and yet he still was picking on the God of the Jews. Now, verse 23, "But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven." There's that pride factor. "And you have brought the temples of his house before you, you and your nobles. Your wives, your concubines, have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone." Now, we'll see Deuteronomy 4:28, where those idol kinds are mentioned, okay? "Which do not see, hear, or understand, but God in whose hand are your life breath, and your ways you have not glorified." Here's the idea that God's in control of human history, even these powerful kings of Neo-Babylon. Now, in verse 25, we have the list of the words that are written on the wall. It's many, many, tekel, upharsin. Let's go back through that. These are a series of nouns, okay? And when you put them back in the noun form, the first one, many, is the term M-I-N-A. It is a weight. It's a measurement. It's a money term. And it's used quite often in the Bible. It literally means to weigh. In 1 Kings 10:17, in Ezra 2:69, in Nehemiah 7:71 and 72, it's used as a weight or a money. Okay? Now the second one, when you bring it in Hebrew, The T changes to an S, H. It's S-H-A-Q-A-L, okay? It's a noun, and when you see shekel, what is that you know? Yeah, it's another word for a weight, a measure, or a monetary unit. Shekel, okay? And in Aramaic, it is the term shekel. It's the Aramaic form of shekel, okay? And it's another weight. So we have a weight and another weight. Now the last word, the U there, upharsin, U is the connective and, okay, in Aramaic. Now, peres is the root word, and it means a half of a weight. So we have a larger weight, a smaller weight, and half of a weight. Now what Daniel does is take these different weights and he makes them participles. And he interprets that the first one means to number, and the second one means to weigh, and the third one means to divide. And so now he's going to interpret this, all right? Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found deficient. Pharis, Many says, God has numbered your kingdom and put it to an end. There's the word number. Tekel, you've been weighed. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Now, it's a play, I think, on the word Paris and the word Persians. They're kind of very close, very similar. Now, when it says the Medes and the Persians, this shows, if you look at the book of Esther, it's the Persians and the Medes. Well, these two kingdoms, at first, Media was stronger and larger, but Persia was much more aggressive, and she became the leader. So in Esther, it's the Persians and the Medes, but it's the same two groups. Now, I think this is going to be the second kingdom. This will be the silver breast and arms, is the Medo-Persian Empire, okay? Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple, put a necklace of gold around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him that now the authority of the third ruler of the kingdom. Now this didn't last very long, for we know from history this was the night of November the 2nd, 539 B.C. Outside the walls this very night was the army of Cyrus the Second. Now Cyrus was not with them. He is not going to enter the defeated city for about a month. But the army was under a man named Gobryas of Gudium, who was the governor later of Babylon. Now, he was outside the walls. I told you earlier how magnificent this city was. It had miles and miles of walls. We learned from other secular histories that a large amount of rainfall had occurred in the area and had swollen the two tributaries and the Euphrates River. That's where all three of these met, right at the capital of Babylon. And they had overloaded the canal system and had washed away some of the walls. Now, whether this happened before the army got in or afterwards, we don't know. But it's interesting that somehow this military man, Gobryas, diverted the Euphrates River, and the army snuck under these thick walls. When the river went down, they snuck under and surprised the garrison and took them totally defenseless. They thought this city was impregnable, and here in one night it falls almost without a gunshot. Now, the people inside saw the Medes and the Persians almost as liberators, especially the priestly class, because their feelings had really been hurt by Nabonidus, who put so much time into the worship of the moon god Zen, and he even moved to her holy city Tema, northern Arabia. But also, apparently, Nabonidus did not even return for the annual New Year's feast. And that was a real affront to the god Marduk, whose chief city Babylon was. And so the people were really ready for a change of government. And, of course, this happened. Now, notice it says in verse 30, really this goes to the next lesson, but I'm going to pick up a little bit. The very same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom about the age 62. Now, this little term Darius has caused us the miseries, I want to tell you. We don't know of a Darius. I've given you a chart when I gave you Daniel 1 had a historical chart of the rulers. There is a Darius the first, but he comes after Cyrus's son Cambyses. It's Cyrus the second, Cambyses the second, Darius the first. And so since I think this is referring to the fall of Babylon of Cyrus, it can't be this later man, Darius the first. Well, who is it here? There's been some speculation. Some think it's just another name for Gobryas of Gudium, who Cyrus appointed governor of Babylon. Others say it's just another name for Cyrus, because we found from the Persian scriptures, the Avestia, that the little name D-A-R-A, Dura, means the royal one and might be a title kind of like Pharaoh of Egypt or Hadad of Syria or Caesar in Rome. And so maybe it just means the royal one, meaning Cyrus the Mede. And we know that Cyrus was connected with Media, Persia in the background. Now, whether that's it, I just don't know. But I think the history here is very sketchy. We don't have a lot of it, and we can't be real dogmatic. And that's what I think we have here. This is a very powerful chapter. Again, this whole series, now beginning in chapter 6, I think is going to be the Daniel and the Lion's Den. But we're making a transition now into a new era. God has shown decisively in chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 that He is a God who is in control of all nations and all history. The Jewish temple may be destroyed. God's city may be in ruins. His people may be exiled. But He is the only true God, and He is in control of all men and all nations. And so in a very subtle way, through the Chaldean wise men not being able to interpret, through God taking the kingdom away from Nebuchadnezzar, taking it away from Belshazzar, we see that God used these powers of the Fertile Crescent, but only in the sense of His judgment on His own people to bring His people back to personal faith in Him. And so here we have an involved, kind of veiled way that God is in control of history. And I think we need to see that. There's a lot of historical problems connected with Belshazzar because we're not sure of everything that connects. But I want to tell you, this is one of the chapters in the Bible that when I do my seminar, you can understand the Bible. I use this account to prove the historicity of the Bible. Because people used to laugh at this chapter and say it's just made up. Look, it's so ridiculous. And friends, the more archaeology discovers, the more this chapter is historicity. The plaster on the walls of the palace, the name Belshazzar is co-regent in the documents. I want to tell you, it just seems that God over and over again fulfills His Word. And that which secular history thinks is so silly becomes corroborated. And that supernaturalism that people spoof at is confirmed to be true, you know. And so I think it's a neat chapter. But now there's going to be another gap now between 5 and 6. We're moving rapidly through this Persian period to set the stage for the major thrust of Daniel is going to be 7 through 12. Now, remember, the figure of chapter 2, these different kingdoms, is going to start being defined in greater detail in chapter 7. 7 and 8. 7 is going to deal with the fourth kingdom. 8 is going to deal with the second and third kingdom. Chapter 11, all four kingdoms are mentioned, but the fourth begins to be emphasized more and more. And so 10 and 12 pick up on the fourth kingdom, which I think is Rome. And that's going to be the flow of Babylon. So starting after we get through the Lion's Den next week, then we'll get into the very prophetic and very difficult to interpret chapters of 7 through 12. And I hope you begin to read Daniel, read more commentaries, because we're getting a very difficult period soon. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.